and on Odyssey. America First with Sebastian Gorka, today at 3, right before Sean Thompson at 4 on AM 560. The Answer.
Dan and Amy, as the Chinese communists relax some of the COVID restrictions that have generated protests against the regime in iPhone City and elsewhere throughout the country. We're still trying to get an answer out of the Biden administration about their support for those white paper protesters. The animatronic Anthony Blinken was on with Jake Tapper over the weekend, and he gave the stock answer you've been hearing all week from the regime here in D.C.
Exact same analysis.
Of course we do. We support the right of people everywhere, whether it's in China, whether it's Iran, whether it's any place else, to protest peacefully, to make known their views, to vent their frustrations. And as that's repressed in one way or another in any given country, we speak out against it, we stand up against it, and we take action against it. In the case of Iran, we've worked very hard to impose sanctions on those responsible for the crackdown on mostly Iranian women who've been leading these, in an incredibly courageous way, these protests since the death of Mahsa Amini, as well as trying to make sure that Iranians have in their hands the communications technology to allow them to continue talking to each other and connected to the outside world. We've spoken out against the repression of protesters anywhere, including in China. But fundamentally, Jake...
That's some answer. I asked you about the white paper protesters in China, and you're telling me about the protesters in Iran and what you're doing. Oh, and yeah, in China too, of course, yeah. By the way, just like they support the support protesters in the rest of the world, just on the domestic front, just as sort of an aside, did you support the Tea Party protesters, their right to protest? More recently, did you support like the Freedom Convoy? Did you support the anti-lockdown protesters around the country? Because I remember it differently. I don't remember an expression of course, they have a right to peacefully protest. I heard a lot of demonization as people who were out there killing people and making life unsafe and so on and so forth. So, no, I don't know about that, even that generic vanilla statement about we support people's right to protest the world over. He went on to explain why they're so mealy-mouthed about China. You know, because we have this relationship and we need to manage it for the world's benefit.
We're in an intense competition with China. There's no secret about that. And, by the way, there's nothing wrong with competition, as long as it's fair, as long as it's on a level playing field. But we want to make sure that that competition does not veer into conflict. So I'll be pursuing these conversations early next year. Others in the administration will be engaged with their counterparts in China. The world expects us to do that. The world expects us to manage this relationship responsibly. And, by the way, if we can find places to cooperate, because it's in the interests of our people, but also in the interests of people around the world, we'll try to do that too. For example, on climate, on global health.
Yeah.
For example, on climate and global health, those are two counterexamples. On global health, have the Chinese communists been working with us to identify the source of the virus? No, I don't think so.
They blocked us for a while from even going into that Wuhan lab.
And you mean, so when you say when there's opportunities to collaborate, you mean for them to pay lip service to us and us to pretend that they're being authentic, that they're dealing on the level, right? Yeah, they're all for your climate change fantasies there, Tony B, while they're building coal power plants all over the country. These guys are a joke. This administration is a joke. And unfortunately, when you're talking about the Chinese communists, it's not funny. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Cindy Yu. She's assistant editor at The Spectator and host of the Chinese Whispers podcast. Cindy, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So were you reassured by Secretary of State Blinken about the U.S. support for the white paper protesters and the line that they're taking with respect to President Xi and the communists?
Look, Dan, I loathe to start the interview by giving you this kind of alternative opinion to yours by disagreeing with you. But actually,
that's okay.
You know, in slight defense of Antony Blinken, the way that the Chinese operate when they see foreign states supporting domestic unrest is to blame all of domestic unrest on foreign states. So they tried to do a little bit of that last week with these protests, saying it was foreign forces, hostile forces, stirring these things up. And actually, I feel like, I mean, I don't have a link to the White House, but I feel like if that's what they were thinking and that's why they didn't come out more in support of the protests, because they didn't want the CCP to be able to say, you see, the White House is supporting protesters. I told you these weren't legitimate Chinese citizens. This is a foreign-seeded protest. So I actually think that would have made things worse had they come out more in support.
So here's why I don't buy that argument, because that argument was addressed, because it was raised ham-handedly, because that's the only way she can raise anything, by Karine Jean-Pierre. And so here's what, and you sort of said the same thing. Here's what they do. Oh, I see. So we know what they're going to do regardless of what we do. So we should play. We should make our play based on what we know they're going to do, rather than make our play such that they're responding to us. Rather than make a play, especially on this issue, so that people around the world are reassured that America still has moral authority to speak about individual liberty, as opposed to playing a game you know they're going to play. No matter what we do, they're going to say it. And by the way, in your own column, you point out, I'm quoting from it, in response to accusations that foreign forces were stirring up discontent, one Beijing student shot back, "Do you mean Marx and Engels?" What a brilliant response, number one. But it also says that the people on the ground aren't buying it. So we should be providing aid and comfort to that Beijing student, not worrying about Chinese communist propaganda, which is built into the price.
Right. And I totally see where you're coming from, Dan. I think that when it's inside China, the CCP has actually not really acknowledged that these protests have happened at all. So, and if you're average Chinese citizen, maybe middle-aged, later, or in your 60s, 70s, you're not on social media, you might not even know that these protests happened because the government hasn't acknowledged them. And I guess what I'm saying is that had it become more of an international debate, then the CCP would have gone even further in saying, this is definitely, you would have had wolf warriors coming out and saying, this, look at Antony Blinken supporting you guys, blah, 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 blah. So I think we would have more of that. I appreciate that just because the CCP is going to do something, it's not a reason not to oppose them, or at least give support to those who do oppose them. But I think it could have been worse. And that student was just absolutely incredible, because he's absolutely right. I mean,
he's getting a better education at Beijing University than American kids are getting, I'll tell you that.
Right. Yeah, it's so rich of the Chinese Communist Party to just talk about foreign forces when they are seeded by Marx and Engels. And, the USSR was a massive formative influence in the early years of the party. So it is rich coming from them.
So, Cindy, after weeks of these, rare displays of public anger, these protests, what restrictions have been lifted?
Right. So, I mean, something that's not often appreciated outside China is actually being such a huge country. There's a lot more that provinces, the regions themselves, can do when it comes to public health. So I think what we're seeing now is actually a patchwork easing up. So various different regions have various different policies. Some regions are actually tightening up. So in Anhui province, for example, there are actually more testing centers being set up. On the other hand, in the south of the country, in Guangdong province, people are allowed to be in quarantine at home now. I mean, this sounds ludicrous to us sitting in London and in Chicago, but this is actually an easing up for people to be able to quarantine at home instead of in a central facility now. So that's the kind of stuff that's moving. You're not needing regular tests just to go on public transport, which you were a few weeks ago. So it does look like things are moving in the right direction. But I don't really buy it until basically they can have better coverage, vaccine coverage of the elderly population, which is not great at the moment. I think there are 26 million over 60s, Chinese over 60s, who haven't even had one jab of any vaccine at all. And that's a massive number.
I wanted to get your perspective about these protests and whether they represent something qualitatively different in the trajectory of the Chinese Communist Party and its long-term viability. Some people are arguing that, this is different than Tiananmen Square, which was a protest that started mainly around economic conditions. This is a protest that's squarely directed at the CCP, and essentially it represents a vote of no confidence in the party to lead the country, and that's something that's different.
I'm not sure I would go that far about this one. I think it is economic at the heart of it as well, just because if you're a small business owner over the last few years, you've not had any certainty. Many of them have gone bankrupt.
Hmm.
Obviously, the party covers up the exact numbers. I don't even know if they collect the exact economic damage done to them to small and medium-sized businesses. If you're a working class factory worker, you mentioned iPhone factory, you have no job security. You don't even know where you're going to be sleeping if there's a lockdown. And so I think that all fuels a lot of the anger. The Shanghai lockdown earlier this year just showed the Chinese middle classes that you can absolutely go back to starvation and poverty, even if you're in these absolutely lovely modern apartments and all this sort of stuff. So I think it is still fundamentally economic in the sense that it's your quality of life that is impacted. Some people, of course, as you say, have made this into a vote of no confidence on the Chinese Communist Party. And as I wrote in my column for The Spectator, the fundamental problem here is that the people have no recourse for the government to do anything else. If you don't like what the government is doing, you have literally no recourse for years and years and years until it boils over to the extent that you're marching on the streets. And so that is the fundamental problem. For me, it's a no confidence issue. I'm not sure a lot of Chinese people actually do see it that way yet. As ever, it's hard to generalize about 1.4 billion people scientifically without opinion polling.
Right. What's the impact of the announcement that Apple's made that they're going to, well, I don't know if they formally made it, but it's being reported that they're going to start moving their supply chain out of iPhone City, as it's now called, and into other places like Vietnam? Like if they were to divest from China and move a significant portion of their operation to another country, what impact would that have?
Well, I mean, it would be terrible for China's economy. I mean, so much of China's economy has been reliant on foreign investors, on foreign supply chains, since it joined the WTO, and probably a little bit before that as well. As you say, though, as you suggest in your question, Apple has said it would do this. Is it actually going to do this? Especially if China is now opening up nominally, and you've got the CCP officials saying to foreign investors, "Don't worry, we're going to open up. By this time next year, this will be all a bad dream." I don't really see Apple bothering to move that much of it out because, as good and as developing as Vietnam and India are in the global supply chain, what they can do is still not on the same level as what China can do in terms of just having cities completely geared towards a particular supply chain. So I think that kind of decoupling, that offshoring will take longer than people want. And so, if you're a businessman, you're going to want to have the easiest ride out of this. So if I were Apple, I would just stay in China and see what goes on next year. But obviously try to divest some stuff. But I think, Vietnam and India are just not equal substitutes just yet.
Cindy, I want to go back to
that's
something.
a good point. Watch and see. Yeah.
Go back to something you said earlier about vaccination rates and the millions of people who are, in that high risk group that are not vaccinated. Why is that happening?
It's incredible, isn't it, Amy? I mean, this is the most authoritarian state in the world, or probably the biggest and most authoritarian state in the world. And yet they are worried about mandating the vaccine. And I don't understand. This is something that me, as someone who's born and raised in China, I culturally don't understand. I've got a few theories, but none of them are completely satisfactory. One is that a lot of people are quite suspicious of Chinese-made kind of food and medicines. There being a few different.
Gee, I wonder why.
Scandals.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, there have been like corruption scandals in the past of kind of your FDA equivalents being corrupt and letting things through, of babies being poisoned by toxic milk powder, all this sort of stuff that leads to a lot of Chinese just being a bit skeptical about something that's Chinese made that they're putting into their own bodies. Understandably. There's also this, I think, just the speed with which the vaccine has been developed has concerned people. But also fundamentally, I think, the complacency that zero COVID afforded people for a long time. You remember, we're talking about this now, but in August 2020, we were talking about the Wuhan pool party. And so China has had a lot of normal times as well during this pandemic. And during that time, if COVID is not in the community, why would you bother putting this vaccine into your body if you're also not sure about it anyway? So I think that all of that has contributed to this kind of moment now. I mean, the government should have thought ahead and thought, with that time that we're buying with drastic lockdowns, we should be vaccinating people. And only now are they starting to think about that. And I think, even though we're talking about easing up in China, it's not the end. This is the beginning. this is the beginning of China's real fight with the pandemic, because now we're going to start seeing community infections in a population of 1.4 billion people. And that's going to be a massive problem.
Imagine the blind spots of the central planners. Cindy Yu, assistant editor at The Spectator, host of the Chinese Whispers podcast as well. Cindy, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Hello, my name is Gina. When I first found out that I was pregnant, I was in a very dark place. I was living out of my car or on the streets, working as a dancer at a nightclub, heavily into drugs and alcohol, and I didn't know how I was going to deal with having a child. You know, people look at someone living like I was and say, that's why we need abortion. I didn't need an abortion. What I needed was help. So Aid for Women helped me move into Heather's house. They gave me everything. A place to stay, clothes, food, a listening ear, help with my daughter, everything. To learn more about my story, watch my video, and support this great organization, go to helpaidforwomen.org. That's helpaidforwomen.org. You can help save lives and souls like mine from abortion today.
Aid for Women offers women real choice. They really do terrific pro-life